After all the buzz around Pop! OS in the recent months, it's now available on Raspberry Pi 4. Based on Ubuntu and GNOME, I wasn't expecting much from it. But let's see if it might be a solid option to consider, and in which case, or if it's just a passing fad. Unlike Raspberry Pi OS, Pop! OS is not available in Raspberry Pi Imager, so you need to grab the latest image on their website and flash it with your favorite tool. As explained in a previous video, Etcher is slightly faster when you have the image already, so I would recommend it. SD cards and USB drives are supported, as long as your Raspberry Pi is configured to boot on USB. So, the installation process is easier with Raspberry Pi OS, but it's not a big deal. You are probably used to do this anyway. The first boot on Raspberry Pi OS is simple. The desktop environment starts directly, and there is an optional wizard to change the main system settings if needed. As Pop! OS is based on Ubuntu, I was expecting an endless post-installation process during the first boot, but it's not the case. The experience is really better than Ubuntu, with something similar than Raspberry Pi OS. The interface is more modern, but basically, it's the same steps. The main difference is that you'll create the first user and password, which is better for security. After the main wizard, Pop! OS will also ask you to tweak a few things like the dock style and the top bar, and give you some tips for using features like the app launcher. Overall, Pop! OS is more welcoming than Raspberry Pi on the first boot, so I think it earns that point. I say it in each video on this channel, but the default interface on Raspberry Pi OS is neither modern nor pretty. The goal is to have something simple to use, but I think it could be better. Anyway, if you are watching this, you probably are used to it. On the opposite, Pop! OS is using a recent GNOME version, which is way more modern even with the default settings. The dock and the workspaces are nice additions to an already good desktop environment. I prefer having a main menu with all the apps sorted by category like on Raspberry Pi OS, but this launcher is pretty good, with a search engine and categories. My favorite tool on GNOME is the system configuration. You get a nice app with all the settings in one place. There is a search engine to quickly find something, and overall, it's way more intuitive than Raspberry Pi OS that has tools all over the place. So, concerning the interface, there is no match. For me, Pop! OS is way better than Raspberry Pi OS. But we still need to see how it works in real usage and in terms of performances, which is a major concern with Ubuntu. Raspberry Pi OS comes in two versions for desktop users. One smaller, with only a web browser and a few other tools, and the full version with all the programming apps, LibreOffice and more. So, it should be easy to get the best one for you, and get started quickly. If you started with a smaller one, you can use the recommended software tool to quickly install something from the full version. But the main issue on Raspberry Pi OS is if you need something else, and you'll probably need other apps. Let's say you prefer Firefox and want to install it. You need to use the Add and Remove software tool. Use the search engine, you'll get hundreds of results. And none of them is the full Firefox version. This whole channel is here to help you to install new things and try out great projects, so you'll find videos where I give you some tips to avoid this problem. But overall, it's hard for a beginner, when using the default tools. Pop! OS also doesn't come with tons of apps. Firefox and LibreOffice are pre-installed, as well as a media player and a few other tools. But you'll also need to install more. What's nice is that Pop! OS includes an app store, like on most modern Linux distributions. These tools are often not working that well on Raspberry Pi because they generally don't include apps for this specific architecture. I feared a similar issue when trying to install Visual Studio Code unsuccessfully. But after testing other apps, it worked well, so it might be something else, or just that some apps are not supported on Raspberry Pi but not filter in this tool. Anyway, that's a way better experience than on Raspberry Pi OS. It requires more testing to see if I was unlucky or if 90% of the apps can't be installed, but at least there is something. As a reminder, Pop! OS is a pretty new distribution on PC, and it's the first release on Raspberry Pi. I'm pretty sure they will improve that in the future updates. Overall, no winner for the default apps, but Pop! OS is easier to use for installing new apps. So, let's give this point to Pop! OS, even if more testing is required. Performances are a major concern when you try to use Ubuntu on your Pi. Raspberry Pi OS has been optimized for it, but for Ubuntu, it's just a side project, an additional architecture. My recent tests with Ubuntu and Ubuntu Mate show that while Ubuntu is more pleasant to use, it is always slower than Raspberry Pi OS. I did some tests to compare Raspberry Pi OS and Pop! OS, and the results are a bit surprising. Raspberry Pi OS will boot 3 times faster than Pop! OS. And I'm not counting the login screen that you have on Pop! OS and not on Raspberry Pi OS. 1 minute for Pop! OS, 21 seconds for Raspberry Pi OS. As a reminder, Pop! OS is a 64-bit system, and I'm comparing it with Raspberry Pi OS 32 bits. But what happens once the system is loaded? Is there any difference in real usage? Yes, overall, everything is faster on Pop! OS once the system is loaded. Even loading Wikipedia is faster with Firefox on Pop! OS than with Chromium on Raspberry Pi OS. LibreOffice also starts faster on Pop! OS than Raspberry Pi OS. These are not huge differences, both systems work well, but it's important to mention it, as we are used to saying that Ubuntu is slow. It's no longer the case with Pop! OS. YouTube works slightly better on Raspberry Pi OS by default, but you can make it work on Pop! OS easily. It's just an indication. So, in short, the performances are not an issue at all on Pop! OS, it's even faster than Raspberry Pi OS in real usage. As a whole, I'm pretty pleased by the result of Pop! OS on Raspberry Pi. It's their first release for this device, so we should be gentle with the developers. They will probably see the first impressions of the Raspberry Pi community, and improve from there. But it's already a great Linux distribution to try, especially for desktop usage and coding. In short, if you were looking for a solid distribution for desktop usage, I would recommend giving Pop! OS a try. In my opinion, it's better than Ubuntu, and I prefer Debian-based systems, so I wouldn't use Manjaro or any other exotic distribution. It's only a personal choice, no offense. And the interface is way more pleasant to use than Raspberry Pi OS. But if you want the full comparison of all these distributions, you need to watch these videos, where I make them compete on each point. Remember to like this video if it was useful, and I see you in the next video.